plugin of the week is the Waves IR Live Reverb. The Waves IR Live Reverb was primarily designed for working with live sound, although it can be used just as well in regular mixing. What separates the IR Live from the IR1 and the IRL is that the interface is even more simplified than the IRL. What you have is the basic impulse response. You see the sample here with the original reverb time. You see the pre-delay control, a multiply or divide on the reverb time, a mix for wet-dry, so you can use this on the insert or use it as a send-return type of scenario, and an output level control. Up top here on the right, you have a dampening section. Now, this is different from EQ, although its effect will sound very similar. What this does is it actually cuts down on the reverb time for the specific frequencies that you were pulling it down on. So if the materials in an acoustic space were, say, more absorptive, then the higher frequencies would get absorbed faster and you would have a decay more rapid in the high frequency reverb time than you would in the low frequency reverb time. And this allows you to adjust plus minus with sort of a shelving circuit, the lows and highs. So it's a very simple interface and it's meant to work that way. Now, one of the things that does happen with this that is slightly different from many of the other plugins that you use, or almost all the other plugins you use with Waves, is that there is a slight delay or latency from the time you make an adjustment to the pre-delay, reverb time, or any of the dampening controls to when you actually hear the effect. And the reason for this is actually very simple, because these are actual audio samples. They're impulse response samples. And so it analyzes the incoming audio, applies that to the actual sample of the acoustic space, and then has to create that sensation of reverb as if that sound were occurring in that live space. That's the basic idea. But because it's an audio sample, that actually does take time for it to manipulate and adjust the sample so that processing can take place. So from that perspective, you have to consider that in terms of automation and things like that, things that you might normally do in a mix. It would make more sense for you to have multiple instantiations with the different settings and bypass or automate the bypass control instead of automating, say, the reverb time setting, if that was the case. So that's the only other consideration. So let's feed a little audio into it. So what I have here is a basic drum sound, and I'm going to mute this for a second so you can hear it here, and I'm going to add in. So we have a little kick and snare kind of feeding into here. And what you could do here is, just like with all of the impulse response reverbs, you can load in a setting. So we can actually go through the individual settings here if we just want to audition some settings, or we can hit the arrows, kind of find a setting you can like. Nice kind of room sounds. I always like the chambers because it's got a little more height or size than a room. So if you say have a room, you can then increase the time here, and then it takes a slight delay. So if you listen, if I shorten it, so it doesn't take very long, but there is a slight latency. And then you can have a pre-delay. So this is the delay before the onset of the reverb. So this is how long it takes before you start to hear the reverb, and that can create a sense of size or distance. Now, when I'm working with this, if I decided I wanted to shape the sound of this reverb, then I have a frequency sweep, which goes from 1600 all the way down to 16 cycles, which is pretty low for the low end. So if I want to do, and you can hear the latency there. So that gives me the ability to kind of sweep that up and increase the reverb time on the low end. And then I could do a similar thing here. Now the high end sweeps only down to 1 kilohertz. So this gives me like a simple impulse response with manipulation of the reverb time. And if I feel like I want to decrease the reverb time a little bit. So it's very cool, and the fact that you're working with samples of actual acoustic spaces makes it great. I'm going to show you one more example here, because if I go to setup B, I can actually have two different settings loaded in. So I can also have access to the acoustic.net impulses, which are available through Waves. So if we go to here, for example, I can go to recording studio space. This is a really good one, the Stone Room. And if I load in the actual response and preset, it'll load in all of the settings. If I load in just the impulse response, I can preserve the settings that I have here, but just use import the sample, and then the same basic settings would follow. Now, because it's like a multiply times on the reverb, that doesn't mean that it's going to end up being the same reverb time, because each reverb space will have a different total length and reverb time, but the general settings will basically stay the same, so you're not resetting the whole plugin. That's the basic difference. So this is obviously like a bigger, brighter space. And the same kind of things here. Where I could do this to kind of, this is already a very bright, very diffusive environment, because it actually is a stone room. But it does allow me to have like bass and treble type controls. I could also warm up that if it's a little bit too much on that end. And you could see how it affects the overall reverb time here, because what happens is, because we're affecting the reverb time, making it less at the higher frequencies, that is affecting the length. So if I reset this, and I can affect that anywhere in between. So you could see how like much control just with the basic settings that you have. And that allows you to just kind of shape the reverb. So it's very simple controls. You're not getting separate control for early reflections like you do on the IR1, and individual direct sounds and individual pre-delay settings for each of the different elements or breakdowns of the impulse response. It's meant to be a very simple graphic user interface, so that you can very quickly load in and set up the presets that you like. You can save them, as you always do, into the preset menu, so that when you load them, you can pick them up from here. And all the samples are here. If you actually get the acoustic.net, download those samples from Waves, then those will be accessible here. I've reorganized some of them into different categories here, just to make it a little bit easier to get to, but you can do that on your own. That'll exist in the Waves plugins folder, in where the application is. So that's the basics of the IR Live reverb by Waves, primarily designed for live sound, but also very valuable for use in just your studio mixing work.